Hello, everybody. I'm Kristen Hunter-Thompson, and I'm super excited to be talking with you all for the next 20 or so minutes about data literacy so we can geek out together and as we start the workshop this week. So I'm going to dive right into things. A little bit about me and who I am. I am a middle school and high school earth and life science teacher. I've also taught at a variety of different informal education settings, environmental and outdoor education, after school family science programs, a variety of different ways. Most recently, I teach undergraduate science communication and storytelling with data and environmental education and communication, things like that. I've worked in policy. I was a fisheries scientist and I studied fish off the central coast of California from a submersible. So I've done quite a variety of different things in my professional life, much to my mother's dismay and worry. But there are three constants in this path that I've taken, which are, I love talking with people, I love learning new things and new ways to solve problems, and I love using data. So while it may seem a bit like a random walk, it's all led me to this place where I've been focusing for the last 10 plus years, where I'm an educator dedicated to inspiring and enhancing people's use of data and their data literacy skills. And so now I get to wear the cool hat of being like, I am a data literacy educator, which I think I made up, but I love it. So why do I love data and why do I spend all of my time geeking out, thinking, how can we get more real world data and data skills into our K-16 classrooms? And largely it's because I think data are pretty awesome. But another component is that we get these amazingly powerful aha moments from data. So before we dive in too much to what I'm going to talk about over the next few minutes, I want us to share out as a community. So I'm challenging each of you to think back for yourselves, when was a time when the light bulb went off for you when you were working with data, when you had one of those moments when you were working with data? And or when have you seen your learners or your audiences have those aha moments where they put the pieces of the puzzle together and got super jazzed and excited about what they were seeing from the data? Because we're all virtual and not in the same space, what I'm going to ask you to do is, as you reflect, share out those stories with one another in the chat box. So let's take a few moments, think, and then add in some comments to the chat box so we can start celebrating as a community these aha moments that we and our learners have had from data. Awesome. Let's take a few more moments. There's always that time delay between the question prompt and when things actually start showing up in the chat feed. Now there's the huge rush of them coming in. Oh. So there's many stories that we all have from data of these aha moments. And I sort of put it out there of let's keep sharing them through the week with one another. One of the reasons why I think data are so awesome is that they tell stories. And these are just two of the plethora of stories that you guys have coming out of the Globe community, where I was pulling some of your data. This is data about kind of the impacts that you guys have had on the community and all the amazing work that you do. But this is what gives data their superpowers, right? Data, much to the surprise of some of our learners, aren't just old boring numbers, right? But when we look at the data, when we get into it, when we play, when we explore, we are actively engaging with the data and uncovering these stories and becoming the storytellers. And we as humans love stories. This is how our brains work. We are predisposed to really enjoy working with stories. And this is the exciting part. This is what makes data engaging so that students can engage with the content that they're learning, what makes it relevant to them. They can see themselves or their community or their natural world, their environment around them in those stories. And so that's an incredible opportunity that we have as educators and folks working in this space dedicated to helping our learners learn these tools of like how to start telling stories with data so they can actively participate, as opposed to when we read information or when we take information from prose and diagrams, it's a bit more passive. We're sort of taking in what others have interpreted from the data. It's this sort of superpower that we actively engage and that we can create stories is why I think data literacy is so critically important and so incredibly exciting for the 21st century. We live in a data-driven world. Some might say data obsessed, but we are in a 8 months of a crash course of how data and decisions from data impacts our daily lives and the decisions that we make. So I would posit that data literacy is for the 21st century what literacy and numeracy were for the 19th and 20th century, where it's these critical skills that we all need as part of society in order to function. So we're all here, we're all taking this time, albeit virtually, to spend time together. We're committed to data, we're committed to getting people using data to understand the natural world. Yet many of us still encounter quite a few people around us that are unable or are unprepared to work with data. And this is something that, right, we as a community work on. There are educators and researchers all around the world that also work on these questions of like, why is that the case? If we have so much data and there are a lot of us working on this, why isn't it working as well as it could be? And I want to spend a few minutes sharing some insights and some challenges that I'm going to put out to you all of sort of things that we can rethink and maybe recommit to doing a little bit differently. But before I get there, I think it's important to kind of pause and just remind ourselves of the reality that we're working in the K-12 space as we are educating people across the globe. And so it is a gloriously complex way that we go about educating our students. And there's variety across countries, there's variety across states, even across school districts here within the United States. We all have the same core mission, right? To educate our youth between the ages of 6 and 18. And more so recently, right, we have a sense of like what we should teach or how we should teach it in terms of our content. But what that actually looks like for individual students is still remarkably variable. And that variability can be to our advantage. It can allow us to sort of do some great in-depth work with certain classrooms and certain schools, as Globe has been doing over the last many years. But it also can be a challenge of like, we're doing all this great work, but it's not having the ripple effects that we're hoping for. Another component, so there's this background level of variability of what it's like to be a student in this education system. There's also the reality of when we drill down to real world data or data literacy skills, it can seem really chaotic, right? And that up until very recently, it was entirely dependent upon the educator and their confidence and comfort and own desire to bring data into what they were doing in their curriculum. And this is changing, right? Data's in the United States, data's been more integrated into our Common Core math and our next generation science standards. This is changing for other countries as well as they're integrating data more into their standards. But it's still pretty idiosyncratic as to like how it looks like in different places. And part of that is a reality of just sort of as people are coming in to embrace more data. And the other part I often try to remind myself is there are quite a few folks that work in the education field that weren't even exposed or had to use Excel when they went through their pre-service program, let alone Google Sheets, which is what, so many of our classrooms now have, especially as we're hybrid. So I think it's helpful to sort of acknowledge that there's this variability and there's idiosyncrasis of what it looks like for our learners. But I think that there are three things that we can maybe think about from a different angle or a different perspective to try to make headway of we're working on this. How can we sort of rethink things a little bit to cultivate seeds in these new ways? So the first has to do with novices and experts and how we take in information differently. So what I'm showing you here are some data from an eye tracking study. I've provided the YouTube link, highly recommend watching it. on your own time. So in this example, Daniel is the expert. He is the professor at the Berklee School of Music, and Charlotte is the novice. She is his student. So while she's a novice in comparison to Daniel, she's much less of a novice than my 5-year-old who had his first piano lesson yesterday. But what they did is they presented them with a new piece of music, a new sheet of music that they'd never seen, and then they wore eye tracking glasses to see. And what we can see is that there are some things that we can prepare for as experts, preparing these learning environments for our learners. And then there are other things that are just different, like where their eyeballs are actually going, where they are like looking to their environment to take in information. And these differences, both in terms of conceptually, how do we break down the content and prepare it and digest it, as we're moving from novice to experts, as well as physically how we're taking in the information, is the reality. It has to do with brain development and how our brains process new pieces of information. But I want to share a few pieces of these novice to experts differences in our brains and how they especially show up when we're working with data. So the right side of this expert side, where many of us, where we all sit when it comes to working with data, this is something that requires time and repetition for us to build over time, right? This is what enables us to make sense of data, know how to work with the data, draw inferences, and make connections to the broader subject area, or investigation, or phenomenon that we're looking at. But it is dependent upon our ability to understand kind of what information we need in which moment, flexibly retrieve that, because our knowledge and our long-term memory is shaped around these big ideas. Whereas our novices, they're still learning. So their ideas are in these disparate pieces and they don't know how to connect them yet. So they don't know how to kind of go into that long-term memory of the knowledge they have and understand what to piece out. So what does this look like, right? We often see this. A classic example is we give our students numbers as data, and they make a bar chart because they are numbers and data, and I should make a bar chart. Whereas we as experts would look at numbers of soil temperature from every month across a couple of years and think of like, oh, well, I'm trying to figure out how that soil temperature varies within a year between years to see interannual variability. I should do a scatter chart or a line chart to look at that, right? Like, given our knowledge of kind of time series and how those concepts fit together, we can make different choices. This is also what results in when we're looking at that time series and when we're looking at this graph of soil temperature over time, we as experts can notice the feature of, oh, like this looks an awful lot like maybe at a temperate latitude where temperatures are lower in the winter and higher in the summer, and we're seeing this temporal signature that's pretty classic across the year. And so and then we can dive into sort of what's the nuance, like where's their variation from year to year across those different points. Our novices will look at this and say, what's going on with the temperature? It goes up and it goes down, right? And so they don't really know how to connect it to those other pieces. So there's a variety of things that are going inside of their brains that's happening that's just really different than what's going on inside of our brains as we're looking at data and working with the data. Another piece of that is that this doesn't fit into those two nice columns like I just showed on that last slide, right? But this is actually a spectrum. As we move from our sort of early novices to our like continuing, we're lifelong learners, we're always becoming more experts at things. And where we fall along that spectrum is dependent upon a variety of things. And within this community, we have a variety of different, we exist in a variety of different places along this spectrum. So what can we do? We can use this to our advantage. If we have a better sense of where our audience or our learners are along this novice to expert spectrum, we can use that to strategically think about, okay, I'm going to go from that perspective of helping them engage with these data or helping them to work with these data, as opposed to, I'm going to kind of go from where I'm at and then maybe take it a few steps back. So my first seed is remember that novices and experts are different, and try to really use that to your advantage to think about Who am I actually working for? Who am I designing this program for? How are they ready to engage with the data? So knowing that who can be really helpful. And there's another aspect going on of that who. Um, there's a many different ways that we use data. There are many different, similar to, there's many different people in the globe community. There's many different kinds of citizens that we have across our societies. And Wolf and colleagues put together a sort of summary of 4 of many, there are multiple different kinds of data literate citizens that I think could be helpful for us to think about as we're designing our programs and putting together the educational efforts that we're working on with data. So I just want to spend a few moments reviewing what they are. So data literate readers are folks that need the skills to be able to interpret data around them. So data visualizations that have already been put together, and then they just need to make sense of those. So other folks have manipulated the data and they need to make sense of those. We're constantly bombarded by data. So how do I make sense of what I am seeing? As opposed to our data communicators who need the skills to be able to actively manipulate and make sense of the data. Maybe they haven't collected it, but they're using the data to make sense, to find those stories, to be able to share those stories out for others to digest, like for our readers to digest. Our data literate makers are folks that need the skills to be able to collect data to solve real world problems. So they understand what the problem is, they've got a question on how to solve that problem or how to learn more about it. And they're going out and collecting the data, and they're cognizant of how that data collection connects to the broader community that they're in and that they're working through. And then finally, we have data literate scientists who are pulling together a variety of different technical skills to collect the data and work with the data, but then figure out what the data is showing and share that out with the broader community. And so all of these types of citizens, these data literate citizens, are important and valuable, and we need all of them. And they all require data literacy skills, right? Like that you need skills to be able to be proficient in any one of these. No. But the trick is that the skills that you need to be a proficient reader are similar, but not exactly the same as what you need to be a data literate maker. And so as we're designing and implementing our programs and creating spaces for people to engage with real world data, it can be really helpful for us to think about, who are we facilitating towards? Who is actually in the room? What kind of data literate citizen are they? Or what is the end goal of where we're trying to get them to? And in that particular moment, in that activity or that series of lessons or engagements that we're having with our community members, and to think about, how are we working towards getting them to be successful of that certain kind of data literate citizen? Because that can help us be more strategic and tailor what it is that we're focusing on. So it's not everything in the kitchen sink with data, but it's really targeted and focused to what our audience needs in that particular moment. And this will help set us up for success, both ourselves, so that we can feel like our program is, working better and they're engaging with the data in the ways that we want them to, but also for them to feel success, for them to have those aha moments and get really excited. So the last seed that I want to share with you has to do with this, getting them excited about the aha and helping them to make sense of patterns. So it turns out our brains, our eyes and our brains and our visual system is really good at seeing a pattern, but it's really hard to see certain patterns within data and what's actually going on in the data. The benefit, though, this is something we learn over time with explicit sort of training and exposure, which is hard for us to imagine, those of us that kind of picked up our data literacy skills along the way. But along the way, we had that repetition to do it. But we can sort of shortcut this a bit. And we can use things like the Gestalt principles of visual perception to our advantage. So we can leverage how our brains take information. So if you're not familiar with these, they came out of the Berlin School of Psychology starting in the 1920s, and they've been worked on and revised in various different ways. Here are 8 of the visual perceptions, and these don't necessarily have anything to do with data. This is just how we as humans take in visual stimulus from the world and make sense in common ways of the information that's coming in. But, right, a lot of data is visual. So we actually apply these visual perception common ways of seeing things without even realizing it. If you want information about these 8 or any others, I've provided a link. What I want to do instead is think about when can we, um, when is this potentially getting in the way, creating extra hurdles for our audience members as they're working with data, and how can we leverage these to our advantage? So first, an example of when we kind of create these like extra cognitive steps for our audience to work on. So the connection principle identifies that our brains, as our eyes and brains, as they're taking in information, if things are physically connected or physically touching one another, we presume that connection has meaning. And so what that means here when looking at this graph, this triangle for Germany of 0.81% mortality rate overlaps with the blue bar of nursing resources at around 1 nurse per 1,000 people. And so before we even figure out what we're looking at or what we're making sense of, our brain is starting to go to the place of like, okay, well, that mortality rate and that nursing level are like, they're the same. Those are, that has meaning to it. Now, whether or not that actually relates to what you can take away from the data is another thing. The challenge is that we've already created that step of like presuming there's a connection, right? The challenge here being is that it's apples and oranges. Mortality rate is a percent, number of resources per 1,000 is an entirely different unit. And so we've sort of created this hurdle by putting these both, not only like putting them both on the same y-axis, which is better than a double y, but we've put two entirely different things on the same axis. We've just created an extra cognitive step for our readers as they're making sense of data. But how can we use this to our advantage, right? So here we're looking at in-service and pre-service teachers in the Globe community, and we connect the dots. We connect the dots because this is a time series and we're looking at changes over time. But we also connect, the benefit of connecting the dots is that that immediately tells our eyes that the top line and the bottom line are two different groups. They're in-service and pre-service teachers. And then we can use the same color of the dots and the lines and the text to give these sort of subconscious visual cues to our brain that those are from the same group so that we can more quickly get our audience and to see what's going on in the data and interpreting the data. Another example where we can leverage, right, the same colors, can make the bars and the text the same across the different countries. Here we've also created a similar baseline for all of the bars and the different groups across the bars. Here that baseline is 0 because in 2015, there weren't any citizen science data entered into Globe. So that is a baseline that makes sense for the data that we're using. But what that does is it draws our eye and our eye can immediately see, okay, now I'm looking at everything above that common baseline and connecting it through. So with some small tweaks to sort of how we orient the data, how we visualize it in terms of color and scope and lay it out of where our title and subtitle are, we can start leveraging these ways that our brains are naturally taking in visual information to our advantage. So the third seed that I present that I challenge all of us to think about is how can we better leverage how we naturally perceive things to our advantage to help our audiences make sense of the data and take away more from the data that we have. And my hope is that we can sort of use these three, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you over the coming days of sort of rethinking how we're approaching getting our learners and our audiences engaging with data and thinking about it. So in that vein, what I'd like to do is put out one more question to the full group to think about what motivates you to support data literate learners. Is there anything that's resonating from what I just discussed or that you could see using or adapting? Let's add it into the chat so we can start sharing those out as a community and building off of one another. So we'll take a few more moments because there's always that delay between me giving the prompt and the chat box coming in. Okay. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys about what motivates you and to learn from you all, but I have just a few more minutes. So I'm going to share some of the things that really motivate me. I think that we need to unpack the big black box of data. I think a lot of people think of data as something that smart people or AI makes sense of. And I think if we give people the toolbox and teach them how to use the tools with data, everybody can start making sense of the data that's around them, be it a visualization that someone else has created or they themselves working with the data to create that visualization. In order for that to happen, though, everyone needs to be able to think critically with data. And I use everyone very purposefully here, because regardless of if you go into STEM or continue in the Globe community or what have you, data show up everywhere, like on our utility bill. So this is coincidentally how my partner and I were able to figure out that there was something a little off by how much we were charged for May 2019, as it didn't fit the pattern from the month ahead or the May previously. We called, they'd read the meter wrong, it was an easy fix. But if we hadn't been able to read the pattern in the data, we would have paid that extra high bill. So we were able to save a bit of money. And I fervently believe that data can be an equalizer, not a divider in the 21st century. And we as educators get that incredible opportunity to ensure that it's the former and fight against the latter. But to do that, we've got to dive in and sort of make it so that everybody can be empowered and have these opportunities to work with data. And you all are doing so much of that incredible work by connecting folks to data and the real world and building this worldwide community of folks that are trying to make sense of the world together at different scales. So how do we do this? We remember data literacy is this huge thing that we're all after. There are many components to it. It's built over time. It's not going to happen in one activity, and that's okay. But we're all working together to move this needle, and it will move. So just like with soccer, they move from the amoeba ball of that my little one's at in practice right now. And over time, repetition, they build these data skills so that they can become these incredible players at the collegiate level and beyond. And we can do that with data as well. So I'd like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to participate and share with you all today. I would also like to thank you for everything you do every day, sharing data in the natural world with communities across the globe. I'm happy to take any questions that you have here as part of this session, as well as you can reach out to me with any of my contact information. So I am going to stop sharing so that I can connect over and answer some questions that folks have. Thank you. Emma or Katie, are there any questions that have shown up through the chat?
I'm not seeing any in the chat at the moment. Lots of thanks and appreciation though. Give it another minute. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Again, Kristen left her email in that presentation, and her slides will also be shared for anyone who wants to use those resources or links. We are going to take a lunch break for now, and we will come back for the lightning talk session from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Mountain Time. That's our first lightning talk session. It's part 1, so we'll be doing that on Tuesday and Wednesday as well. Thank you again, Kristen. This is a wonderful presentation. And yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I look forward to learning from you in the coming days. Thanks for everything that you do. Bye.